Hello, everyone. My name is Sebastian Straub. I'm the Principal Solutions Architect here at N2WS, where I have the privilege of designing and implementing innovative cloud solutions for businesses across the globe. And my role involves ensuring that our clients enjoy robust data protection and disaster recovery, so they can focus on their core operations with confidence without having to worry about data outages and such. Let's get started with what kind of services are available. So AWS offers just the right service for each usage pattern. Amazon EBS, Elastic Block Storage, there's nothing better than that when it comes to speed and versatility. But EBS works just like hard drives from days gone by. If your hard drive exists in Sydney, but your server is in Singapore, well, you need a really, really long cable for that. And that's why there's S3. It's really for unstructured data. And then there's also EFS, Elastic File System, and FSX, just to confuse you a little bit further. They're additional services. They're very fast. They scale automatically, which means you don't have to pre-plan anything, and it's fast and convenient. And you guessed it, fast and convenient. That's why it's expensive. Then within S3, we also have Glacier. And Glacier is really for archival data. So let's take a closer look at S3 here, because that's really where some of the biggest storage savings are hiding. And the charge is led by standard S3, followed by storage tiers that are increasingly colder. But for backup data, and especially archival data, that makes a lot of sense. So just to visualize the different storage tiers that you have the capability of using within AWS, and then ultimately also store your backups in, we have a little matrix right here. So you can see AWS snapshots are kind of expensive, 5 cents per gig. They're instantly available. That means I can have that near zero RTO. I can get the data instantaneously back. Now, if you were to store the data in standard S3, as you can see, that's half the cost of your snapshot. The only problem is, by standard usage of AWS, there is no direct path from EBS snapshots or even from RDS snapshots into S3. And that is something that N2WS allows you to do. And I'll go into more detail about this as well. There's other storage tiers below that. So we also have S3 infrequent access. That's really if you're saying, I don't think I'm ever going to touch the data. I really just need to store it in case I need to get to it. Then you also have something called S3 intelligent tiering, which actually uses infrequent access, but I'm going to go into detail about that as well. What are the advantages here? And then ultimately, you also have Glacier. That's really one of the coldest storage tiers. And as you can see, that is considerably cheaper than the regular snapshots. So if you do the math, that's what, a 92, 93% savings for your backups. And deep archive Glacier, well, it doesn't get any cheaper than that. I usually joke around, that's so dirt cheap, you might as well keep the backup forever, because that's 99 cents per terabyte per month. And if you do the math there, it's about a 98% savings. The reason why a lot of people shy away from using Glacier or Deep Archive to store backup data into is because of the AWS Service License Agreement. So it's the retrieval time. How fast can I get to that data? So for Glacier, AWS says, well, recovery of that data is going to be anywhere between minutes to 12 hours. And if you're recovering data from Deep Archive Glacier, expect at the bare minimum 12 hours. So for that really quick recovery of data, it's not ideal, especially now in the cloud era. People expect recovery times to be a lot quicker. You might have seen that picture of me all the way in the beginning. That's an older picture. I have considerably more gray hair now. And I remember back in the day when you performed the recovery of your backup, I remember when backup recovery that takes a day was completely acceptable. Nowadays, we want the data in minutes, because every single transaction that's lost, that's money. And any moment that your employees can't get to the data, again, that's lost time, which equals money. But one more storage tier that I do want to talk about here is also Glacier Instant Retrieve. I think that's really the best one of them all. And the reason for that is because it's the best of both worlds. You're utilizing Glacier storage, but at the same time, you can get to the data instantaneously. So you see that over here with the retrieval time. And the storage cost savings are almost like Glacier. So again, if you do the math, that's about a 90% savings. So if you want to keep the data for at least 90 days, that is probably the storage tier that you want to take a look at, because whatever you're currently paying for your storage cost within your AWS invoice, you can lower that number dramatically. And you're probably wondering, well, why are we talking about these S3 storage tiers? Because, well, within AWS, there is no capability of moving the snapshots into S3. That's why we're going to do a demo. And I'm going to show you how you can do that within N2WS backup and recovery. So first off, this is the N2WS backup and recovery console. If you're not familiar with us, we are a cloud-native backup solution which allows to create backups using cloud-native methods, completely agentless, just creating snapshots. The first thing you're always going to see is the dashboard is going to tell you anything that happened as far as disaster recovery backups, archives, and also a lot of other information as far as how much other backups are going to cost me and how much money can you save. Now, if you go into the backup policies, you can see I already have a bunch of policies configured, but let me take you through a different policy that you can create here. First off, you can create backup schedules. These can be as flexible as you want it to be. The smallest increment is 60 seconds. So theoretically, you could have an RPO of 60 seconds. And this is also flexible, which means I could say, well, yeah, that sounds great. Let's perform backups every 5, 10, 15 minutes during business hours. Outside business hours, I'm just going to fall back on backups maybe every 6 hours, every 8 hours. Backup targets, that's where you're going to choose what you want to back up. There's two ways of collecting resources, either fully automatic through tagging, so somebody spins up a resource, it will automatically be recognized, and then we can sort those resources into the appropriate backup policies. And of course, you can also do this completely manual because it's a graphical user interface. Point and click. You can choose to back up instances that will include the volumes, or you can also exclude certain resources. You can also back up RDS databases, all the different flavors there are, Aurora clusters, all the different flavors, including Aurora serverless, Redshift clusters, DynamoDB, Elastic file system, we just talked about that, and then FSX, all the different flavors, Lustre, Windows, and also FSX on tap, and we even have the ability to sync S3 buckets. But what we did want to talk about was how can we save money for those backups? Because creating snapshots, yeah, that's great. And you're going to be able to recover the data almost instantaneously. But how can I save money? Because backups are like car insurance. Nobody likes paying car insurance, but it's great when you have car insurance when you get into trouble. So let's take a look at how can we lower these storage costs. So at the top of the Lifecycle Management tab, that's where you can see this is how many native snapshots we're going to keep. These native snapshots, remember, they're near zero RTO. I can recover the data very, very quickly. Now down here at the bottom, this is where I have this toggle box where I can say, well, I'm going to keep this many generations of snapshots. In my case, remember, I'm performing daily backups, super conservative. I'm going to keep 2 weeks worth of backups and snapshots. So over the course of 2 weeks, I'll be able to recover this data almost instantaneously. Then I can say, well, let's keep the data for a little bit longer in S3 because it's so much more affordable. And I can choose to keep this data in S3 for either X amount of time or X amount of generations or a combination of those. Even though human brains usually work with time, people usually tell me, I want to keep the data for 7 years. Nobody has ever said, I want to keep the data for 384 generations. So here, this is where you can choose how long you want to keep the data in S3. And then if you keep scrolling, at the bottom, you also have the option, well, eventually, after X amount of time, maybe I want to put the data in even colder storage. So I could put the data also into Glacier. And that's generally used for data that you need to retain for a very long amount of time. Now we're going to get to the real cost savings, because here at the bottom, this is where you choose which storage class are we going to use in each step. So the very first step, that's going to be native cloud snapshots. And then the next step is going to be S3. And then the next step after that is going to be Glacier. So that's represented right here. You choose the repository, the S3 bucket, where you want us to store that data. And this is a real, true, visible S3 bucket. And these S3 buckets, they can also be immutable as well, which means we can also store the data in an immutable fashion. Over here, that's S3, that very first step. So I can use standard S3. And as we've seen in that matrix, standard S3, that's half the cost of your snapshots. So just simply by storing the data in standard S3, the very first tier, I'm already saving a tremendous amount of money. And then, as I mentioned, there are other tiers underneath that. So infrequent access halves that number again. So it's a 75% savings. The only, in quotes, disadvantage of infrequent access is, well, you must keep the data there for at least 30 days. But if you keep the data for at least 30 days, that is a good storage tier. Intelligent tiering, I did promise we'll talk about that a little bit more. Intelligent tiering utilizes infrequent access, but it's the storage tier that you would use if you're not sure if you're going to access the data. So if your access pattern is you need to get to your backups quite frequently, quite often, then intelligent tiering is probably the better choice. The way intelligent tiering works is it stores the data in standard S3, and without you having to do anything, if you don't touch the data for a certain amount of time, it's 30 days, then behind the scenes, the data will be moved into infrequent access. And it will stay there, and you will then receive the full storage cost savings of infrequent access. If in the meantime, at some point you do access that data, behind the scenes, without you having to do anything, the data is being stored, moved into standard S3, and then it's still a 50% savings. And then if you don't touch the data for a certain amount of time, again, 30 days, and then again, the data is being moved into intelligent tiering, and with that, infrequent access. So it really depends on if you're thinking, I don't think I'm going to access the data. That would be infrequent access, or intelligent tiering if you're saying, I do think that I'm going to need that data probably quite often. And then over here for the archive storage class, remember, that's that last step here. We also have the ability to move these snapshots into real, true S3 buckets. And these buckets can be stored in Glacier. Remember, 92% savings. And ultimately, we can even put these data packets into deep archive Glacier. But as I mentioned, there is that problem that Glacier, anywhere from minutes to 12 hours, deep archive Glacier recovery time is 12 hours. So that's why under the immediate storage access class, you also have the option to use Glacier Instant Retrieve. That makes a lot of sense because, well, it's the best of both worlds, as I said. It's about a 90% savings and the data is instantaneously available. So there's a huge difference here as well that allows me to really make the best use of all of this, to store the data in the appropriate storage places, in the appropriate storage tier. So if I go back to my slides just for a moment, then I also wanted to show you the grandfather, father, son methodology. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Grandfather, father, son, or GFS backup methodology is a system of data backup that involves keeping multiple copies of data at different points in time. And the grandfather backup is the oldest backup, followed by the father backup, and then the son backup, which is the most recent. It's like having a family tree for your data. You could also imagine this data family tree as a bunch of rowdy kids, and you're the parent trying to keep track of them all. The oldest, wildest child, that's the grandfather backup. It's been around the block a few times and seen some stuff. The father backup is like the middle child, not as wild as the oldest, but still has some stories to tell. And then finally, the son backup, that's the youngest and most innocent of the bunch, and it hasn't had much time to get into trouble yet. And by keeping multiple backups at different points in time, you can ensure that even if one of your rowdy data kids get lost or corrupted, you've still got the right backups to fall back on. So the reason why I wanted to talk about the grandfather, father, son methodology is because you can very easily implement this in N2WS in that same section we were just in. So the way you can configure this, and it's really the maximum savings as far as your storage cost is concerned, is the ability to keep a limited number of snapshots. If something terrible goes wrong, when does it happen? I used to be in another lifetime a backup admin. And my personal experience is it's usually, let's go back to the backup from yesterday, or let's go back to the data from last Friday. Hardly anybody says, I need to access the data from last October and ideally access that within seconds. Nobody's going to cry if you tell them, you know what, that recovery from that backup from October last year, that's going to take 15 minutes instead of 15 seconds, especially if you tell them, oh, and by the way, we're only paying 8% of the storage cost we normally would pay for snapshots. So that's why it makes sense to keep as few snapshots as possible. So remember, in my policy, I'm performing daily backups. So that means I could say, well, let's keep 7 backups. Over the course of 7 days, I can have that near zero RTO. I can get the data back instantaneously. Well, once we get past the 7 days, I then will tell my users, my data stakeholders, well, if you want to get to data that's older than a week, it's going to take a little longer because the data is going to be reassembled from S3 buckets. But look at the storage savings. We're saving over 90%. That's where this step comes in. So what you could do here, grandfather, father, son, you could say, well, these are all of my son backups, my daily backups. And then I'm going to perform an S3 archive backup at the end of the week. So that's going to be my weekly backup. And I could say, well, I'm going to keep that for 1 month. So that's my 4 weeklies. And then if I scroll down here to my archival storage, this is where it's getting interesting. I could say, well, at the end of the month, take one of the monthly backups then and store that in a really cold storage tier such as Glacier or Deep Archive Glacier for X amount of time. Depending on your vertical, especially usually I see this in the financial sector where there's a requirement to keep data for a very long time, or architectural studios, right? Architectural studios, they need to retain the blueprints of anything that they produce for the lifetime of the structure that they created. And if you think in Europe, if they created a bridge, that could be 500 years. So keeping the data in a very affordable storage tier makes a lot of sense. So this easily allows you to create a single backup policy, which then covers grandfather, father, son backups. If I keep scrolling to the bottom, remember this is where we choose the different storage classes. I also have the ability to do the same thing with RDS. So I remember a few years ago, RDS was pretty new and people were mostly experimenting with it. I would say within the last 1.5 to 2 years, I've seen a lot of companies really lean into the RDS service, and some rather large RDS databases are the result of that. So having seen RDS databases in the terabyte range or multi-terabyte range isn't unheard of. And if you're keeping a snapshot of a terabyte database, that gets really expensive, especially if you want to keep the data for longer than a few days. If you want to keep the data for a week, a month, a year, or even longer, well, then it makes a lot of sense to put the data into an S3 storage tier, which does allow you to save up to 98% just simply by storing the data in the appropriate storage tier. So that's an ability that you have with the grandfather, father, son, and having the ability to just simply store all that data in the appropriate storage tier. Let's go back to our slides. There's another slide that I wanted to show you as well. How about using your archive as your disaster recovery? The 2 questions come up. So what does it mean to use archive as DR? And what's the advantage of doing that? So I'll show you that as well. So the first thing is, if we go back to our backup policy here. So if I go into my backup policy, and I'm going to choose, as I said, I'm choosing to perform backups on a daily basis. And here I can choose which resources we're backing up. And as I said, it's all of these different services that we're backing up. But something that you have to keep in mind is the cloud native snapshots. Cloud native snapshots are being produced in the same region where the data is currently residing. And in this case, it's North Virginia, East 1. Now, when my backup lives in that same region, and that region goes down, that's bad news. So that's what disaster recovery backups are all about. I'm sure you've heard about disaster recovery backups. It's just simply the ability to take these snapshots, these backups, and make them available in another region or make them available in another AWS account altogether. And that can be easily achieved using the DR capability that we also have in our product. Remember snapshots? That's at near zero instant RTO. So we have the ability to turn that on and create disaster recovery backups in other regions. So my production environment lives in North Virginia. I create a disaster recovery backup in Ohio. Now, you can also create disaster recovery backups in multiple regions, because you could say, well, what happens if North Virginia and Ohio goes down at the same time, right? So in this case, I can also choose, well, let's create backups in Asia, and why stop there? Let's create a backup in South America. And at that point, only an earth-ending event is going to take out my infrastructure, because I literally have a backup available on every continent. Down here, this is the ultimate in peace of mind. That's going to allow you to create a cross-account disaster recovery backup, which means we're going to create a backup of the data in a completely separate, unrelated AWS account. Kind of interesting for ransomware attacks, right? So if my account gets hacked, gets compromised, but with this feature, I have the ability to recover the data in a different region or in a different account. And again, I have the choice of all of the different regions as well. The only problem with this is it's going to increase your storage cost, because you're essentially creating multiple backups and you're making them available in other regions and in other accounts. So that's the trade-off. So remember what we wanted to talk about. What about using your archive as a disaster recovery? So let me show you what that looks like. So if I go to our backup monitor, the backup monitor, that's a single pane of glass. Makes absolutely no difference where the backups are being prepared, which region, which account. Gosh, doesn't even matter which public cloud service they're being created in. Because N2WS Backup and Recovery even has the ability to create backups for you in your Azure account as well. Very simple. You just need one single N2WS server, and that reaches into multiple accounts to create these backups. This allows me to create chronological view of all of my backups. I can filter this by accounts, by users, by policies, and the resources themselves as well. So theoretically, if somebody were to say, hey, can you show me all of the Active Directory servers? Sure, I can show you all of the backup sets that contain that backup. And of course, I can also filter this by cloud providers. So I could say, show me everything we're backing up in Azure, show me everything we're backing up in AWS. But let's get back to our DR. So remember the policy that we were manipulating? That was my Windows policy. So if I choose that, and I choose to recover from that backup policy from that date and time, I'm going to click on Recover. Here I see the different resources that are stored. I can recover the entire resource, the entire server. I can recover certain volumes. I also have the ability to recover certain files and folders from it. That's a cost savings as well, because this allows me not to recover everything, just recover what I actually need. Also has the ability to create multi-generational file and folder level recovery. It's a really fancy way of saying that we can browse for multiple backups at the same time. Let me give you a quick short example. If somebody comes here and says, I'm missing a file or a backup or a folder, can you get this back for me? You're probably going to say, when was the last time you had that file and that folder? And I also know what they're going to say. They're going to say, I don't know. Well, that's terrible, because now I need to browse through all of my backups to see when was the last time you had that file or that folder. Remember, I mentioned that I was a backup admin. I'm speaking from experience here. Multi-generational file and folder level recovery allows you to browse through multiple backups of the same resource. There's a search capability. It's completely agentless, and it even allows you to do this ad hoc without pre-ordering the files, pre-cataloging, or pre-indexing the files. But we're getting off track. Let's get back to the DR backups. So up here, I can choose, where do I want to recover these resources to? So I can recover the resource to the same region where the data is originally from. I can also recover to a different account. And because I actually have a disaster recovery backup, I also have the ability to recover the data from that other account. Remember my cross-account disaster recovery? The only problem with this is because we did talk about there are snapshots, and these snapshots are available in certain regions. They are available in my original region and my designated disaster recovery region. Remember, in my case, that was Ohio. So I now have the ability, if North Virginia goes down, I can recover the data easily in Ohio. But what if my boss says, I changed my mind, I want to perform a recovery in Frankfurt? Then my answer would have to be, well, yeah, but I can't perform a recovery because we didn't plan for this. The disaster recovery snapshots, they're only available in that region, in that account where we made them available, where we chose to make them available. This is where your archive comes into play. Because remember, the way we store data, that archival data, is we take the snapshots, break them up into data blocks, into packages, and then store them in real true S3 buckets. So that means we can recover these backups in any region and in any account because we are rehydrating the data. Let me show you what that looks like. So I actually have a backup here. So this one backs up my Linux instances, and I deleted all snapshots. That's another feature, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. I'm not keeping any snapshots for this backup. All of my backups are actually going into an S3 bucket. So when I choose that particular backup, I'm going to click on Recover. Then I have the same options here. I can recover the entire server. I can recover certain volumes. I can recover certain files and folders. And of course, I can also recover the entire resource to a different region. So that's my original region, North Virginia. But now if I want to recover it, I can recover it into any region. And that's really nice because if my boss says, hey, I want to perform a recovery into Frankfurt, sure, I can do this, no problem. Because we are recovering the data, we are rehydrating the data in a different region. Any region of your choosing makes no difference which one we're choosing. And you can even recover the data to any account that you have defined as well. Because again, we're rehydrating the data in that target region, in that target account. So there is a lot of flexibility, not only cost storage savings if I store the data in an archival storage in an S3 bucket, but I also then have the ability to recover the data without any pre-planning in any region, in any account. And you can choose where that S3 bucket lives. That S3 bucket doesn't have to live in North Virginia. It doesn't have to live in your primary account. It can live in any of your accounts, which then, of course, also gives you the ability, remember, immutable backups, and the ability to store that immutable backup in a completely separate account. Well, it doesn't get any more safe than that. So that gives you the ability then also to retrieve the data and regenerate that data in any account. Probably one thing that you're thinking at this point, well, this all sounds great, but what if I recover that data now in a different account or in a different region? What's missing? Well, my network configuration, because that doesn't magically get transferred. We're just talking about resources here. But we also have the ability with N2WS Backup and Recovery to recover the data and also recover the network configuration that's associated with as well. So we're talking VPC settings, subnet settings, routing tables, security groups, transit gateways, VPN connections, any meaningful object within your environment, we can capture that information. I can show you what that looks like. So here I have the different accounts that I have access to, as I said, my Azure accounts, my AWS accounts. And then when I choose one of my accounts, see, I can also see the inventory of the VPC settings, the network configuration settings that we stored. So I can see the VPC settings, the transit gateways, the different regions where we captured network configurations, the different VPCs. And I also have the ability to go back to a certain point in time. So we're not just willy-nilly storing and capturing your network configuration. We're actually monitoring if there's a change. If there is a change, we're then going to capture that data for you as well. So if somebody were to say, I want this file server to be exactly in the state it was in on November 18th, 2020, I can do even better. I can even bring back the network configuration for that time and day as well. And I have the ability to take that network configuration and clone it into a different region. I can clone it into a different account. I can give it a different name, and I even have the ability to turn it into a CloudFormation template. So either I could use the functionality right here, that entire process takes about 20-25 seconds, or I can also turn the network configuration into a CloudFormation template. So that even if you didn't start with infrastructure as code, we can turn your infrastructure into code. So this is really the complete package. That gives you the ability to store not just the content of your resources. That's super important, no two ways about it. But it also gives you the ability then to recover the entire network that's associated with this. And all I talked about right now is really one-offs, right? Let's bring back one server, one file, one folder, one service, one RDS database. What happens if that entire region fails? Well, the recovery scenarios is going to allow you to do this. This is a playbook on how your disaster recovery should occur. And it's completely automated. See, I have one. That one is from Virginia to Ohio in my primary account. This one down here, that's the worst case. It doesn't get any worse than that. So this is failover from Virginia to Ohio, and at the same time, failover into a different account. I'll show you how this works. It's laughably easy. All you have to do is you choose the destination account, where should that data end up? You choose the destination region, and then you choose what are we failing over. So in my case, that's just 2 servers, but it makes no difference. Could be 100, could be 5,000, absolutely no difference. You also have the option to choose the recovery order, because sometimes certain machines like to spin up before others, especially when we're talking about Windows servers, right? Then on each resource, I can also make configuration changes. Right now it says auto assign, which means we're going to recreate that data exactly as it was when we captured it. But you can change your mind. You could say, well, I'm going to make it bigger, I want to make it smaller, or actually want to put it into a different VPC. I want to put it into a different availability zone. I want to give it a different IP address. So that is an option as well. So once you create that perfect scenario, how to fail over an entire region, and you can do this within the graphical user interface, then you have a failover scenario, recovery scenario. And then all you have to do is 3 more mouse clicks. You're going to choose your failover scenario. You're going to click on Run Scenario. Then it's going to say, which backup set would you like me to keep as the base for this? Well, probably the one from last night in my case. All I have to do is just click on the Recover button. Then my entire region is going to fail over, including my network configuration. And wouldn't it be great to use that same feature then for disaster recovery drill testing? Because yeah, I can create backups, but how can I prove that they're actually going to work? That's really where it's important. So when I go back into my recovery scenario, down here at the bottom, see you have a schedule option. And this works just like the backup schedule. So this can be as often as you want it to be. As luck would have it, I already created one a little bit earlier, quarterly. Every 90 days. Every 90 days, I want to create a disaster recovery drill. And I have 2 options. I can either spin up the resources, and of course, there's a price tag. There's a cost involved because AWS is going to charge you because you're spinning up resources. There is a reason why Jeff Bezos has his own space program, because they charge you for everything. Now, you also have the option to choose dry run. Dry run is almost as good. It will check, do I have access to the snapshots, to the accounts, to the encryption keys, to the permissions, to actually have everything in order to perform a recovery, short of actually spinning up the resources. The best part of dry run is it gets you 98% there, and there is no cost. There is no cost involved because we're not actually spinning up the resources. We're doing everything other than just spinning up the resources. The frequency with which companies create disaster recovery drills is probably twice a year, maybe once a year. And the reason for that is it takes time, it takes effort, and it costs something because you're actually spinning them up. That's not the case with dry run. There's nothing to keep me from performing DR drills once a week because we can. It's a dry run. We're going to check if we have everything that we need in order to perform the recovery. And wouldn't it be great to also get a report about this? I can do that. So all I have to do is just simply leave my email address here. And then the product, all I have to do is just click on save. The product is going to perform, in my case, 90 days DR drills, or if you wanted to perform a DR drill every week, you could, and it's going to perform that DR drill fully automatic, and at the end, send you a report that it was done. One of our larger customers, DB Systel in Europe, just recently tested this feature as well. So they were able to fail over 733 servers in a little bit under 30 minutes using this feature. And the only reason why it did take 30 minutes is because, well, like I said, certain servers like to spin up before others. So this really allows you to be absolutely sure that not only are you performing backups, not only are you performing disaster recovery backups, but you also have the ability to get the data back in a timely fashion, and that the data is completely perfect, in a perfect state. So this is the disaster recovery capability that we have. One more thing about disaster recovery, because we did want to talk a lot about disaster recovery capabilities and how to save money. So N2WS, as I mentioned, has the ability to perform backups in AWS, but also in Azure. We switched to Azure. One of the questions I usually get, why should I use you guys? Because Azure has a backup built into the system. So I have different workloads, they're right here. And then within that workload, within Azure, there's a backup capability. It's right here. And yes, it absolutely works, not a problem. It works pretty efficiently, but hardly anybody clicks on this button right here. See where it says learn more about pricing? Let's do that together. Let's take a quick look. So when we take a look at Azure Backup Pricing, you'll find that backing up an instance with Azure Backup is going to be $5 plus the storage consumed. Fair, that's the backup itself. But did you notice that this only applies if the instance is smaller than 50 gigs? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the vast majority of your production instances, they're probably bigger than 50 gigs. More likely, you're going to be in this tier right here. Well, now the price doubles. That's just a privilege to perform backups. You're still going to have to pay for the backups themselves, storage consumed. And if an instance is even bigger than 500 gigs, not unheard of, well, you're going to be in that third tier. They're going to charge you $10 for each 500 gig increment. Just last week, I had a customer who was performing backups using Azure Backup in Azure, and he was backing up several instances which were 1.2 terabyte in size. That means he was paying $30 per instance just for the privilege to back them up. N2WS is a much more affordable storage capability. So in our case, we don't care how big the instance is. So this is something that's also very important. Another question that usually comes up is, well, what am I losing here if I use you guys? Because you're considerably more affordable. Absolutely nothing. We're using the Azure API in order to perform cloud native access to the backups. And that's exactly what Azure Backups is using as well. So there's no difference whatsoever, other than that's how Azure tries to get you. They're charging you by the size of the instance. So that's really the main differentiator. And of course, within Azure, we also have the ability to perform disaster recovery backups as well. So now we come full circle while we're talking about disaster recovery backups. All right, let's go back to our slides. Now, this is really just a very quick overview of the different capabilities that we have. So we are an operational backup and disaster recovery tool, purpose-built in AWS and in Azure. It's a cloud-native solution, born in the cloud for the cloud. And as I showed you, really flexible backup policies. We're having the ability to perform backups every 60 seconds if need be. And they can be very flexible. So you can fall back on a greater interval if that's not needed. Deployment of N2WS backup and recovery is super quick. It's just simply an AMI that is being deployed through the marketplace, pre-configured, pre-installed. And as I mentioned, you have that near zero RTO that allows you to recover from any outage of any type of outage within seconds. And user-friendly, oh, you've seen that yourself. The product is extremely intuitive. It's a graphical user interface. It makes it very, very simple for anybody to learn the product extremely quick. It should mention our third-party integrations as well. So we do have detailed reporting and auditing within the product. Then, of course, we also have third-party integrations into reporting tools such as Datadog, Splunk, Bocata, and we even have a RESTful API. So if you want to fill information from within the product into a ticketing system, you can do that as well. So then a couple more things that we did talk about. One more thing that I wanted to mention as well is archiving data into S3 buckets. What people usually say at this point, they're saying, this is very great. It sounds good, but I wish I would have known about you guys maybe 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago, maybe a year ago, because now I have so many snapshots that I created, and I wish I would have known about the capability of putting that data into S3 buckets. But we can do that as well, and I'll show you how. So back into the product, when you go into the policies, remember you have the ability to choose that backups are being stored in S3 buckets. But what we're going to do with pre-existing snapshots, we have something called an AWS importer policy. This is how you configure it. Again, as luck would have it, I have one of those, so I can show you what they look like. So the way this works is you point us at an AWS account. Then you tell us, well, which time frame are we looking at? So in my case, I did an import here from 2020. And that can be any end date as well. So that means we're going to scour through your snapshots in that time frame. Then we can also be more selective if you're saying, well, there are certain tags attached to these snapshots. That's how I want you guys to collect them and put them into the appropriate backup policies. You can do that as well. And the S3 storage configuration works exactly like I just showed you earlier. So you have the ability to put it into S3, you have the ability to put it into Glacier, and remember down here, this is where you can choose which storage class are we going to use. So you could say, well, I'm going to keep some snapshots. Remember, we did talk about this, grandfather, father, son, some snapshots, then some infrequent access, and then eventually the data stores in Glacier. So this, when you have this importer policy allows you to import the snapshots. And then at the end of that process, the importer policy is going to say, well, every data was now imported. It's safely stored in S3 bucket in the storage tier that you chose. Would you like me to go ahead and delete the snapshots? When you do that, then all of your backups are still available in an S3 bucket, safe and secure, available very, very quickly, but you don't have the storage cost anymore for those snapshots. That's a savings on day one. And it's very, very simple to deploy N2WS backup and recovery in your environment to immediately make use of that. Kind of sort of the same feature I did mention earlier is the ability to not keep snapshots at all. So if that is something that you can live with, then you have the ability to turn on, let's back up the data into S3. And this is the feature that I wanted to show you. It's the any snap feature. So what this feature does, this little tick box here, it means that we're not going to keep snapshots. Yes, we're going to create a snapshot, but then immediately turn around and archive that data into an S3 bucket. And then ultimately at the end, we can then go ahead and delete that snapshot. So that is really for maximum savings, because this allows you to not keep any snapshots at all. And again, you have that flexibility. Once the data is in an S3 bucket, remember you have the ability to recover the data into any region, into any account. So that's really then a visualization of what we just talked about. So archive the data into any of the available S3 tiers really for long-term savings. But then you also have that any snap archiver capability. So if you want to deploy this on existing snapshots, you can do that. And if you're saying, hey, maximum savings sounds like a great idea, then you also have the ability to use the zero EBS snapshot feature. This means we're not going to keep any snapshots. Everything is going to be in that really flexible, really robust S3, possibly even an immutable. And then you also have the ability to create the storage repositories in different regions, as I mentioned. So those S3 buckets, they can live in any region. They can live in any account. And you can also keep track of your costs through the N2WS Cost Explorer that's built right into the dashboard. So this allows me to keep track. That's a running tally. You can even extract reports on how much is each policy costing me per month, per week, per day. So if you have different departments and you need to create different invoices for the different departments, you can easily achieve that as well. And I think one of the most important things is the plethora of different AWS services that we can back up. So EBS, EFS, FSX, all the different flavors. EFS also gives you the ability to recover certain files and folders from a file system. If you have a 1 terabyte file system and somebody says, can you retrieve that 8 kilobyte file that I really, really need? Well, if you're just using regular snapshots, then yeah, you're also going to have to recreate an entire terabyte file system to get to that one little file. That's not the case in our product. Remember, I mentioned that file and folder level recovery, that also works for EFS. So we have the ability just to dive into a backup, just recover what you actually need. Then DynamoDB, Aurora, all the different flavors, including Aurora, serverless, Redshift. And we even have the ability to create SAP HANA backups. And this allows us to create application consistent backups on your SAP HANA instances. So that means really every transaction, even the transactions that are currently in memory, are going to be stored. And you can easily deploy this using our product as well. And then, of course, store the data across regions, across accounts, depending on what your requirements are. This is just a quick overview. We did talk about all of this, but we're also going to send you the slides as well, so you don't forget. It's the multi-generational file and folder level recovery, which means we can actually get to the files. We can search through the backups, the recovery scenarios. That's for that DR drill that can recover your entire environment very quickly. Most importantly, gosh, in my opinion, is really that VPC backup, because the network configuration, not having a network configuration, that's pretty bad. If I were to compare this to back in the day on-prem, if I would say, I'm going to bring back one of your servers and I'm going to put it on your desk, but I'm not going to give you any routers, no switches, no cables, no connectivity, you'd probably say, that's not going to do me much good. It's the same thing with cloud resources. If you bring back a resource and you don't have any of the network configuration, especially if you're performing a DR into a different region or into a different account, well, that's not going to do you any good. People need to be able to get to the resources as well. Multi-generational file and folder level recovery. If I were to leave you just with that word, you would probably say, he did talk about this, but I don't remember what it actually was. So this gives you the ability to actually dive into the backups and recover certain files and folders. And the most important thing is it doesn't require pre-indexing, no pre-cataloging of the content. This can be done ad hoc without any pre-planning whatsoever. There is no agents needed for this either. The VPC backups, we did talk about that as well. Really important to have the ability to bring back your network configuration. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I mentioned this already, and the recovery scenarios. And most importantly, not only can I run these recovery scenarios when needed, when something actually goes down and I need to bring back my entire environment, but I can also use these recovery scenarios as my DR drill. And the system will just simply fully automatically perform these disaster recovery drills, which is really nice because, as we all know, if you're working in IT, you're probably busy every single day. So this is just another task that you can just instruct the product to do and perform for you. Which brings us to the last slide.
That was fantastic, Sebastian, and you shared a ton of good information. So, like you mentioned, we will be sharing a recording of the presentation and the slides and a personal follow-up with everybody that attended today. And thank you so much to everyone for attending. I just wanted to quickly comment that we do have a few minutes here for Q&A. So if there is any open questions, feel free to pop them into chat or into the Q&A panel. And just as a quick follow-up, Sebastian, maybe you want to share a little bit about our cost calculator that we have on our website, because if folks are wondering how they can model where storing things, especially backup data in different storage tiers and how that might affect their environment, that's a great resource to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, AWS is a great service, don't get me wrong. I love AWS. It really democratized cloud resources and resources in general. There's no outlay of funds in order to spin up servers and have them for a longer amount of time. The only drawback is AWS sometimes doesn't make it very easy to see, well, what should I use and how should I use that particular service. So AWS does have a calculator on their website, but I would say it's going to take hours to learn how that works. So we do have a calculator on our website as well, which does exactly what I described. Essentially, you're just putting in how much data you have, how much data you expect to have, and then it gives you the ability to very clearly, very easily see. Sebastian did talk about the different S3 storage tiers, standard S3, then infrequent access, intelligent tiering, deep archive, Glacier, and then of course also the Glacier instant retrieval. So our calculator on our website is super simple. It works exactly how you think it should work. You just simply tell the calculator how much data do you want to store, and then it will give you examples of, well, this is how much money it can save you using the AnySnap, importing your existing data. That's simple, that's easy. All you have to do is just simply look at your AWS invoice. It'll tell you how much storage you have currently used within AWS. And just take that number and put it into our calculator, and it'll tell you how much money you can save over time. 90 days, 180 days, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, however long you want to keep the data. It's very simple, very easy. It's just like our user interface, because having a tool that's really good, well, that's obviously a good thing to have, but the tool also has to be very simple to use. Interestingly, I saw an article a long time ago where the original project manager of the Mac, the Apple Mac, said, well, the reason why toasters are so popular is because you just put a slice of bread into it and turn it on, and then toasted bread comes out. That's really how all tools and utilities have to be. Very simple to use. Then you'll also make use of them.
Well said, and thank you. And I put a link to that calculator in chat. And you also get a little takeaway if you enter your email address, and that's this basically a business validation brief that was done by ESG, an analyst group that kind of took a look at the claims that Sebastian was making on today's webinar, and did some validation work with their own environment and just kind of tested it to see what the differences in pricing were between storing backups as EBS snapshots and then in an N2WS repository in Amazon S3, and then different variations of either saving a single snapshot or saving no EBS snapshots at all, and just trying to play around with the different levers within their backup environment to see how they can best optimize to meet their SLAs and their kind of service level agreements. And I think that's what the game is all about. It's about making sure that you're spending an appropriate amount of money on Amazon Web Services storage and on your backup infrastructure without overspending. And that's certainly an area that the N2WS team can help with.